I think that a few months ago in the ALR, I published a list of bestsellers and the topic was religion. And at least 8 or 9 of the books were anti-religion. So the best-selling books in the religion category were against God. They were the Hitchens, the Dawkins, and our own practitioners such as Tomas Pataki with his book Against Religion. It does seem, in recent years particularly, that it's the atheists who are hogging the headlines. And when the church is in the headlines, it's often for the wrong reasons. So what I'd like to ask our panellists first of all, I'll start with Gerard, is what's your take on this? What's the state of play of religion in Australia, in the West? Is it in decline? Is atheism in the ascendancy? Or do the atheists just have better publicists?
They've certainly got more eloquent protagonists, I suppose. I mentioned in the article that on the ABC's Q&A, Christopher Hitchens was on with what I would regard as good a representative of thinking, believing Australia in the form of Father Frank Brennan. But Frank is quite wonderful on matters to do with Indigenous issues, social policy, human rights. But I felt he was really out of his depth actually talking about God and the existence of God and the whole rationality involved in that argument. Yeah, I think they've got better publicists. In a general way, though, I think reading particularly James Jupp's Encyclopedia of Religion in Australia, that partly because there is so much still migration going on in Australia and we are such a multicultural society, we have a continuing influx of new believers all the time. I very much come from a Catholic tradition, and I'd always want to say that Catholicism in Australia has been not an institution so much as a tribal phenomenon, and I think that tribe is disintegrating very fast. And I think there are 2 things that essentially brought that about. One was that Catholicism and belief, the belief involved in Catholicism, was identified very much with Irishness here, and it was a mark of the underdog, and it was the badge with which people tried to get into the establishment. And I think Catholics, from the start, they were against the establishment, but they wanted to become part of the establishment. And what happened in the 50s, of course, and into the 60s, was that the DLP opened the bridge for Catholics to move from the Labor Party across into the conservative establishment. And about the same time, the Vatican Council came and the whole vast edifice of Catholic culture started to fall down, so that now so much of the raison d'etre of Catholicism, at least as a cultural phenomenon in Australia, fell away. And I think the matter of belief, actual belief in God that should have been at the centre of it, is exposed. Just how many of those adherents were really interested in the matter of God or believing in God, and how many were held there by this culture that seems to me to have gone. Next question, or another question that I won't get onto at the moment, is Islam. Will Islam in Australia go the same way? But it's my take.
We'll get onto Islam soon, but before we do, Peter, your thoughts on the relevance of religion today in Australia, the ascendancy of atheism?
The new atheism, which I imagine some people in the audience would be very sympathetic to, given that large numbers of people in society are sympathetic to it, is it's a fascinating phenomenon, I think, because I think it's a form of evangelism, and I think it's a form of fundamentalism. I mean, you know, we're aware of the distinction between a belief of some complexity which is held with all sorts of degrees of qualification, which remains a conviction, and we're aware of relatively simple Bible Belt style faiths. And it seems to me that what characterises the new atheism of the Ditcheners, as they're called, I mean of the great Chris and Richard. I mean, apropos of Hitchens, I've said this before, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say it, but Christopher Hitchens, you know, if you look at his career, that man wrote demolition jobs of Che Guevara, famously of Mother Teresa, and of Princess Margaret. He was clearly working his way around to God, you know. And I think he's very much like, you know, the description in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar of Cassius by Caesar, someone who cannot behold a greater than himself. And I suppose the Christian fundamentalism is rather, Judeo-Christian fundamentalism is based on the idea of a being who is immeasurably greater than oneself. But it does seem to me that the new atheism is a rather simplistic belief. That is not necessarily to discredit it, but the kind of loathing and abhorrence and disdain which Dawkins, for instance, would express in relation to anyone professing, let's say, intelligent design. Remember when President Bush allowed intelligent design, which some people would say was a surreptitious form of creationism, to be taught in American schools. I mean, I think both Dawkins and Hitchens and the particular tribe, though not Thomas Pataki, are tilting at windmills because they're attempting to demolish beliefs which no learned Jesuit or Methodist would hold.
Yeah. At the same point, Peter, I would have said, just so viewing those two guys on ABC television when they were here within the last 6 months, that they were highly rationalist, and people were not willing to take them on in those terms, those that were put on panels with them or interview them, and tended to fall back on statements of faith. It's a matter of faith, and you've got to have faith, and took particular objection to what they regarded as their arrogance or their manner, their superciliousness and so on, which I didn't think was enough.
Right.
So that I had a sort of a sympathy. I thought this is what I feel has been the tradition of Australian religion. That is essentially a lack of
a fear of argument.
Strength, yes,
yeah.
Showing up when it came to this sort of crunch.
Well, I would have liked to see Dawkins matched not against Frank Brennan, with all, you know, who was a lawyer and a man very much in the Catholic tradition of good works. I would have liked to see him matched against someone like Tony Cody, the emeritus professor of philosophy at Melbourne, who was a Catholic but very much a contemporary philosopher within the Anglo-American tradition. I mean, one thing that you don't get a whiff of from listening to Dawkins and Hitchens, and I'm not qualified to hold forth about this, but I just know it as a matter of fact, that you know, you'd be aware of the fact that one of the greatest influences on that Anglo-American tradition of philosophy was a very great philosopher, Wittgenstein, and many of Wittgenstein's disciples ended up as Christians because Wittgenstein, you know, who famously, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent, allowed room for religious belief.
Yeah. I suppose, my feeling is that somehow or other in Australia, either the media or the people, I don't know, with any kind of influence in arranging these matters have picked the wrong people, or there is this ongoing failure of nerve to actually go out and confront the eloquent and hard-hitting atheists. And I don't see that changing very much. I think that certainly Christianity in Australia, it seems to me, is not picking up its game when it comes to revivifying any kind of intellectual tradition. There are all sorts of problems here, I suppose, that traditionally it was the clergy who were the theologians. So it had to, there's that was very much confined to, and there's a joke, I think, in Decline and Fall early on, when one of the Evelyn Waugh's characters says that lay interest in theology is one of the first signs of madness. And I think Australians have very much taken that position too. And yet as the number of clergy declining, and the clergy I think are moving more and more into good works, and they're leaving the intellectual field sort of pretty fallow, really.
Isn't part of the difficulty, Gerard, that religion for a long time has had to speak the language of agnosticism, so that, I mean, in terms of non-clerical Christians in our society who've got a marked commitment to it, someone like Morag Fraser is not going to, who, famously with Eureka Street and in her general writings promulgated a very superior liberal Christian publication. I remember Don Watson saying to her in my presence that he thought Eureka Street, this was 10 or 15 years ago before Stephen's ALR, was the best magazine of its kind in the country. But Morag would not break her neck to talk about God. And it's interesting, when I thought I was going to be delivering a 3,000-word peroration on this subject, I was thinking about the highest level of this kind of thing. I was thinking about two things. Like, there is this particular religious movement, which is a form of atheism. There are people who, as a matter of faith, are atheists. Now, the other large grouping, which you alluded to in your article, apart from the Christians and the Muslims and the obvious groupings, the largest Anglo, for want of a better word, grouping, which is clearly formed of converts, is Buddhists. And I mean, as someone who was once a drug-addled hippie, I'm aware of the fact that Buddhism to the baby boomer generation was very attractive because it was... I remember as a very young man reading a man called Chogyam Trungpa, who was a very fascinating Tibetan who escaped from the Chinese and went on, like, Deepak Chopra, who's an Indian, of course, after him to thrive in California. And he wrote a very elegant primer to Buddhism in which he said, Buddhism does not require theistic insights, nor does it reject them. In other words, you can be a Buddhist without believing in God, and you can be a Buddhist and believe in God. I suppose the most celebrated Christian proponent of high spirituality in the second half of the 20th century was a man called Thomas Merton, who was Gerard would be very familiar with him, who was a Trappist monk. And he died in Thailand. He electrocuted himself with an electric shaver, which of course is very, very Zen. And his last letters say, "Amiable Buddhists everywhere hail me as the mop switch of wop switch." And when he died, the people in the community said, he is an incarnation of the Buddha, and one of the tests of an incarnation of the Buddha is a crocodile will come out of the river and eat a dog. And it happened, which of course appeals to my hagiographic Catholic, or lapsed Catholic soul. Buddhism is very opposite to Dawkinsite atheism because it doesn't insist that you nail your colours. What it emphasises is meditation, calm, the life of quiet, you know, a kind of orientalised Quakerism or whatever, though of course Quakerism is a form of Christianity. But that's the other strand, and that's the opposite strand that's gaining converts, I think.
Yes, certainly. James Jupp's Encyclopedia makes the point that Buddhism is in fact the second largest religious creed in Australia, and it has attracted far more people of European origin than any other creed has. Islam, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and so on. And he makes the point, or the person writing his articles makes the point that, as Peter says, it doesn't require belief in lots of ways. It's, at least not theistic belief, in lots of ways it's a reaction to a grim existentialist situation, and it's a form of developing various techniques for coping with that. So that in lots of ways, I think it sort of appeals to a fairly pragmatic and probably non-mystical streak that has always existed in Australian people or Australian religions. The notion of actual, I suppose, direct discussion of God within the Australian intellectual community is something that does not happen now. But I've always thought that insofar as it has happened, it seems to me that it's been done in Melbourne. And an article that I always cite to people, or a piece of writing that I cite to people, is probably the best bit of theology ever written in Australia that I have ever read at any rate, was an article in the 1970s in Quadrant by Vincent Buckley, which was entitled The Strange Personality of Christ. Now, it seems to me, apart altogether from Buckley being unique, that this is not the sort of article that you're going to get, and you wouldn't have got for a long time, in a fairly major intellectual publication. But it was an extraordinarily winning, convincing sort of piece of writing, although in fact it wasn't set up as a polemic in any sort of way. It was very much, I am going to take a couple of scenes in St John's Gospel and I am going to treat them as a person doing a piece of literary criticism, and what I get out of this is this extraordinary figure. He is like no other figure. He demands an utterly unique kind of reaction. Now, I just don't think that kind of thing is happening anymore. And of course that happened in the context of a major movement, above all at Melbourne University, but reflected in some ways at other universities around Australia at the time, where religious belief and religious commitment of some kind was fairly openly espoused, and it was known. I just don't think, again, that's the situation any longer.
Gerard, in the article you write that Jupp's Encyclopedia allows us to see the real religious Australia under its supposed secular exterior. So the atheists may be louder, our intellectuals may not be talking about God, but you seem to be suggesting that perhaps we're more religious than we realise. Is that a fair?
Yeah, certainly the Jupp's encyclopedia is worth looking at just for the illustrations. The photographs are of two kinds, and they're all in colour. They are either of religious ceremonies being performed or of places of worship. And the extravagance of the scenes that these depict is illuminating in itself. I mean, I came away thinking, I didn't have any idea that Australia was so outre. It's just not what I see walking down the streets I walk down every day. And yet there are many, many groups practicing their religions in this extremely vital and culturally rich way. I think that, as I said earlier, Christianity has got, I suppose I'd incline to say, a bleak future in Australia. But Islam, if I can talk about that now, seems to me to be the thereby is the big question for the future. Just as, I felt in my experience, Catholicism was a tribal thing, and to some extent, once when I was growing up, and for many generations before that, a boy could have and be absolutely at home in two cultures with two identities. I was an Australian and I was a Catholic. I felt there was absolutely no conflict between those two, but they were two complete cultures, and they meshed as well, so that we had Don Bradman and Bill O'Reilly in the Test team just as much as they had the Mason Don Bradman. Proportionately more Australians went to the more Catholics went to the First World War than men from other denominations. And yet,
despite Mannix's opposition,
despite the whole, the anti-conscription rally and Mannix's view of the war. I was talking to a friend the other day who'd written a book recently, Michael McKernan, about Jugeong, little town. He said there's no war memorial in Jugeong. He was trying to work this out, and he come up with a theory that 39 men from Jugeong, which is down past Goulburn in the northern Riverina, I suppose, area, small little village. It's the people, not the buildings there. 39 men went to the First War, but 26 of those were Catholics. And he says he rather suspects it was because people responsible for war memorials at the time were the landed gentry round about, and they didn't feel inclined to put up a memorial to so many Catholics in the area. Now, that may be a kind of latter-day inverted bigotry, but bigotry is another thing that I think has only fairly recently gone out. I once, and this is about the only name I could ever drop, I had dinner with Patrick White, and I was about to go to Ireland, and he said, "Why you go to Ireland?" And I told him. And he said in his sort of best sepulchral voice, "Ireland is an old man sitting on a bridge watching the water go by." And then he said, "I hope you're not going to Cork." And I said, "Oh, I have no idea." And he said, "Cork is priests and nuns and dead rats." And I thought, this is simple, good, old-fashioned anti-Catholic, anti-Irish bigotry. You are a man of your class and your generation. So and that's yet, what. Sorry.
And yet,
religion. Yes.
Patrick White was himself, very haunted by religion, isn't he?
Yes, indeed.
And there's a letter,
non-denominational way. Yes.
There's a letter. There's an interesting correspondence between Patrick White and James Macaulay, who James Macaulay, the Ern Malley man who ended up. He converted to Catholicism and was quite a firebrand conservative editor of Quadrant. But there's a correspondence between him and Patrick White in the early 50s where Jim Macaulay is clearly coveting the soul of Patrick White and wants to convert him to Catholicism, and Patrick White writes back, quite respectfully and sympathetically, saying, "I must climb the mountain in my own way."
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That I think that by and large, that old kind of evangelical wish is another thing that has passed. You get odd cases now. Again, when I was growing up as a Catholic boy, we would hear a lot about converts, and of course there was all the English converts of the 30s and so on, people like Evelyn Waugh and Chesterton and others. But one that's recently struck me, of course, is Malcolm Turnbull. I find it very hard, and there's part of me that greatly admires somebody who can make that leap these days into belief. I think it is much harder to move into religious belief than to lapse away from it, or even to take a step away from it. I think the culture is so much against it. I wonder often about the process that can lead someone there.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it? I think in inner urban Melbourne and Sydney, and among the Chatterati and the Champagne socialists, etc., I think of my dear old friend and enemy, Maury Schwartz. I once wanted to do a quarterly essay about religion, because I thought we should get someone like Geoffrey Blainey to write it, because clearly we had to handle the right in such a way that we published them, but we published them innocuously, and I thought religion would be a good playing ground for Jeff, because he's very sympathetic to religion. And Murray said to me, "Oh, Peter, Australians don't care about religion, and something in a lot of us would probably be inclined to nod assent to that. And yet, when you look at recent Australian politics, we all want to look away from absolutely contemporary Australian politics at the moment, but if you cast your mind back to last year and to those fears about, Abbott as a mad monk, this was happening in a context where for the first time in a long time we had a kind of weekly church-going Christian Prime Minister of markedly intellectual bent, and where his very small L Liberal, should he have been in the Labor Party, opponent Malcolm Turnbull was a convert to Catholicism. There were Christians plaguing us on every side in politics, and that doesn't tally with the secular self-image we all have. But then look at Australian history, and who was the great spectre in the horizon of Australian historiography? It's Manning Clark, who was obsessed by religion, and who said in one of his great moments of essentialism, the Australian character comes out of the tension between the English idea of the just person and the Irish idea of a human being as larrikin and saint. And of course that's incorrigible, you can't prove it or disprove it, but it's a very suggestive way for a great mythopoeic historian to talk about a country. Manning, of course, son of a vicar, Melbourne Grammar, Oxford, buried by the mix though, and always haunted by the idea of a cross.
Yeah. Yes, I think this notion of people's religious allegiances being held up out there, such as you've mentioned in the current political situation, provokes an odd reaction, as you say, the Tony Abbott mad monk, and this mantra about his religious beliefs are going to get in the way of his political detachment and so on, as though religious beliefs are a different sort of belief to other beliefs, that somehow or other beliefs whatever they are, non-religious beliefs, agnostic beliefs, atheistic beliefs, don't interfere with judgment. I mean, any human being makes a judgment coming from the whole human being that he is. But there is an uneasiness about someone who is a believer that seems to, that certainly says they are distorted. They have to be distorted in their judgments.
So that unease operated apropos of Abbott rather than Rudd, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
That might be because no one understood what Rudd believed in or stood
Believed
for.
in, no, indeed, yeah.
But we may as well talk about contemporary politics, seeing we've got religion and politics now. We'll move on to the third bit soon. But now we have a Prime Minister who I saw described today as Australia's first atheist, or leading atheist. She is an avowed non-believer. We have Tony Abbott, who is an avowed believer. Do you think, Gerard, this will make any difference at all in the election campaign?
No, I think there are too many other issues that, yes. No, I don't think that's getting any oxygen at all.
It won't change anyone's vote?
No, no.
Peter?
All the pundits out there are as good as...
I think Julia Gillard, one of the things, praise the Lord, so to speak, which she's handled with some suppleness, is her atheism, because she said that she doesn't believe in God. She's an atheist, but she doesn't want to impose her belief on anyone else. So that last night there she was with George Pell at the big Mary MacKillop canonisation or pre-canonisation dinner, and some prelate asked, I think I saw it in the paper, would her atheism, from his point of view, get in the way of her being Prime Minister? And he said, does a doctor's atheism get in the way of his practice? Yeah. Which is a sensible response, I think.
And of course, being at Mary MacKillop, an event for Mary MacKillop, is so very Australian, because there is Mary MacKillop. She wasn't a mystic. She didn't do great penitential exercises on and against herself. She wasn't some sort of an ecclesiastic authority. She was a person who really wanted poor girls to get some sort of an education. A great cause, really, for any decent politician to get behind.
And also, although Julia is an atheist, she's an unmarried, childless woman who is dedicated to her ideals or goals, which gives her something in common with other sisterhoods.
Indeed, yeah.
We might just backtrack one question so I can ask you, Peter, the same question that Gerard has already answered. Well, to pick up on what he said that the future for Christianity in Australia does appear bleak. Do you agree with that? And also, what's your take on where Islam is going to fit into all of this in Australia over the next couple of decades?
I think the future of Christianity in Australia and throughout the Western world, throughout America and Europe and Australasia, is bleak, and was, I suppose, always going to be bleak. I mean, when I was talking about Buddhism before, one of the things that struck me when I was preparing this was that, one of the greatest poems of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, the work of an Anglo-Catholic, an Anglican of the most Catholic variety, is nonetheless expressed in the most agnostic language. I mean, it's full of Christian iconography, but the climax of that poem in Little Gidding, or penultimately before the climax, see now they vanish, the faces and the places, with the self which, as it could love them, to be renewed, transfigured in another pattern. Now, the thought behind that, if you like, is deeply Christian, but the expression is very agnostic, and it's quite close to Buddhism, and it doesn't take a huge effort of assent on the part of any agnostic or atheistic sensibility. And I think that's always been there on the horizon for Christian belief. I think the future is probably bleak for religious belief of a traditional Christian kind. I think the militant atheism is a displaced form of religious belief. You know, Jung said, "Be careful when you throw religion out the door, because it'll come in the window." That doesn't apply clearly to Hitchens so much as it applies to Twilight and the whole mystagoguery thing. Islam, I don't know. It depends whether you put on your calm cap or your scared cap, I think. I think we should accept that Islam is one of the world's great religions, one of the major religions, that the Sufi tradition of Islamic spirituality will compare well with the heights of Hinduism or Christianity. But I think we have every cause to be fearful of Sharia law, of Islamic fundamentalism and fascism. Obviously, there are quite explicable political reasons for 9/11 and for the spread of international Islamic terrorism, and American foreign policy has helped that. I mean, what better to spread it than waging a war in Iraq when Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11. But I think there are reasons to be worried about it, and I think there are probably reasons to be wary of our own multiculturalism in relation to the extent that it ever finds itself at loggerheads with intolerance. We should tolerate everything except intolerance.
Yes, it's a question in my mind. I sidetracked myself earlier, but I keep trying to compare to some extent the history of what I call the tribalism of Irish Catholicism with Islam in Australia, and I think Irish Catholics were always wanting to be part of Australia and not second-best citizens and so on. Now, the question to my mind is, at the moment, is Islamic Australia, because it can't be identified with any one particular national group as we could with the Irish, is it wanting to be part of Australia as well as retain its Islam with the same, equally loyal to both, wanting somehow or other to meld the two? And what happened, obviously, once, as I suggest, once Irish Catholics felt they were part of the establishment, that the whole Irish Catholic thing started to disintegrate. I would imagine that once Islamic Australians felt they really were part of Australia, I would think that certainly the solidarity of their particular tribal group would collapse too. I think there would be far more apostasy, to use that old-fashioned term, amongst young Muslims. But I don't know. I mean, maybe people in the audience have got informed views on this. Is there that same feeling in the Islamic community really to want to get into and be part of a core Australia that I think Irish Catholics more or less always had?
Does Jesus have a part in any of this going forward, as Julia might say? Jared, you might start if you want.
Stephen originally described me as How did you describe me? I've forgotten again.
Generally a believer.
Generally a believer, yes. I often think that I say to people, perhaps my hope is stronger than my belief, which is to some extent a cop-out. We could say we all hope, because the notion of eternal life is such a wonderful mirage to be able to follow. But insofar, but I think my position is essentially that I do not feel that I am doing violence to myself by continuing to hold on to some belief. I think it is a reasonable thing to believe in the story of the incarnation, what I regard as the central message of the gospel, that the divine word became human being and did something for us, though I find it hard even now to explain what salvation means. And I don't think it is an unintelligent thing to believe in a God is responsible for the universe. At the same time, I'm also very aware of the fact that this is the culture I was born into. It is so much easier for me to perhaps want to hold on to that because I was born to it. I am so encultured with it, and not only born into a Catholic family, but then I had 7 years as a Jesuit, so I got much more of a drenching, I suppose, in that whole tradition. For me to throw that over, I don't find that there is convincing enough rational reasons for doing so. Hence, yes, the figure of Christ, because I essentially believe in the Gospels, and I believe in the Gospel story as having some historical validity and personal appeal to me. I find him an enormously attractive character that I kind of do want to reach out to in some way. Yes, sorry. Struggle, sorry.
Peter, Christ, has he got life in him yet?
I'd reckon. It's complicated, I think. I think for a large number of people in our society, this whole thing is almost completely meaningless. I think a large number of people, whether they describe themselves as atheists or agnostics, just don't give a stuff about all this. Like whether there's some central intelligence there or not, it's got absolutely nothing to do with the way they think about their lives, whether or not they view traditional or modified Christian teaching with any sympathy or not. I think a lot of people are just over all that. And within that group of people who are over it, there are the militant atheists who think, thank God we're over it, thank God we're beyond the kind of hideous cruelties that Christianity visited on the world. And there's no denying that it did visit astonishing cruelties on the world, and you don't simply have to point to the Spanish Inquisition or Protestants and Catholics burning and disemboweling each other in Tudor England or whatever. There's the particular kind of pain that people suffered as a result of the theological rigours of Christian upbringings. Anyone who grew up under the fiercest kind of Calvinism in Presbyterianism or low church Anglicanism, anyone who got the rough end of the Jansenist tradition in Irish Catholicism, where you'd have lovable middle-aged women thinking they were going to suffer eternal perdition because they'd looked sideways at someone, remember the moment in Huckleberry Finn where it's a moment of great moral grandeur, where he decides he'll help Jim, the slave, run away, and he says, "All right, I'll go to hell." Now, there are a lot of people who were brought up as Christians who simply because they, they were 16 and they were in love with a girl or a boy and they couldn't resist doing it, actually had something like that crazy Huckleberry Finn experience of thinking, all right, I will go to hell. I will be damned for this because, this erotic impulse, this love impulse is more important to me than anything else. Now, I can understand why people hate a religious system that could do that to human beings. I understand it intimately. However, I think the Christ thing, if we're talking about the figure of Christ, I think the figure of Christ, the figure of the Madonna too, for that matter, are absolutely central to our civilization. I remember, I think it was Susan Sontag who sort of said, bloody hell, you get kids these days and they don't even understand the Stations of the Cross. And I think she was a Jew of the Jews, but it's our culture. We can't turn our back on that. I mean, you can turn your back on any bit of it, but I mean, who wants to turn their back on the great paintings of the Renaissance or the passions of Bach, or I think it's Foucault of all people who says the glimpse of the face of Christ, which you get in the novels of Dostoevsky. I mean, it's in our DNA. It's part of what we are, and if we want to reject the horrors of religion, bearing in mind, as Walter Benjamin said, that the history of civilization is always at the same time the history of barbarism, we should hold on to the good bits.